All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. If everyone can find their seats. Thank you so much for being here for this very special Science on Tap. We are so excited that you are all here. My name is Cinnamon Moffett. I'm the Research Program Manager here at Oregon State University's Hatfield Marine Science Center, and I will be your host for this evening. Just a reminder, this is a hybrid event, so we have lots of folks in the room with us today. We probably have similar number of folks online. So for those folks that are online, thank you so much for being here. I hope you're someplace comfortable with some good food and drink, and you're spending the evening with us, so we thank you. A couple little logistics about this event. For folks online, this is a webinar. So that means that your cameras, mics, and screen shares are disabled, but we hope that you communicate with us if you need us in the chat box. So if you have any technical issues, our volunteer Roseanne, hi Roseanne, it will help you out if you're not able to hear or something weird is going on. You're also welcome to put any questions you might have for the speaker into the chat. Roseanne will read those out when we get to our question and answer section so that you can participate in the discussion as well. For folks in the room, because this is a hybrid event and this is a very large room, it means that you need a mic to answer or to ask a question. So when we get to that section, if you just raise your hand, I'll bring you this mic. Or if you're impatient and you don't want to wait for me to run around, there's a mic over on the side of the room and you're welcome to go to that space as well to ask your question. Couple other little announcements before we get started. This is our last Science on Tap of the academic year. So we usually do them once a year or once a month during the academic year. And so this is our last one in May. We'll get started again in the fall. For those that join us every time, thank you so much for being a part of this series. We really enjoy you being here, and we'll kick it off again in the fall. Okay. So without further ado, I want to talk about why today is such a special Science on Tap. And that's because today's speaker is the recipient of the HMSC Lavern Weber Prize. And before I hand it off and give it to our speaker, let me just tell you a little bit more about what that means. Dr. Lavern Weber was our first resident director here at Hatfield from 1977 to 2002. During that time, he actively cultivated an atmosphere of cooperation. So the HMSC Lavern Weber Prize honors those that make a significant contribution to the marine sciences and conservation through innovative, transformative, or groundbreaking research that supports creative solutions with broad impacts. This year, Dr. Rod Fujita is our honoree. So we are so excited to have him here. Rod has a distinguished career as a marine ecologist and research experience in wetlands, coral reefs, and system ecology. He is a senior scientist with the Environmental Defense Fund studying global warming and is researching safe and efficacy of approaches to drawing down atmospheric carbon dioxide to slow the rate of climate change. Rod has authored over 80 peer-reviewed publications and 2 books. One of those is Healing the Ocean, which chronicles ocean conservation success stories. This other title, I'm going to be careful when I read it out loud, Making Shifts Happen, which shows how to apply cognitive science and behavioral economics insights to solve complex social and environmental problems. And we are just so excited to have Rod here with us. Can you welcome him today?
Thank you so much. Okay. All right. Okay. I think I'm live. Can everybody hear me? Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm so honored to be the inaugural recipient of the HMSC Lavern Weber Award, and I'm honored to be here tonight with you in this beautiful facility. So some of you may have come here expecting a presentation where I impart knowledge of some kind, but I'm actually going to pose this big question. Can the ocean help us fight climate change? And like any scientist, I'm going to start with one question and end with many questions. So just to prepare yourselves for that. Okay, let me use this. So this is a good news, bad news story. Let's start with the bad news. Climate change is upon us. It's no longer a theory or models or projections. It's lived experience. Wildfires, extended droughts, stronger hurricanes, rising sea levels. spread of new disease agents, and hotter and longer days. We all know this is happening. And the reason those projections back when I started in this field about 40 years ago are so right on, all this stuff was predicted by these models way back then, is because there's a strong theory underpinning the relationship between gases like carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide that trap heat in the atmosphere and cause the Earth to warm. Now, we know that because we have failed to take action on climate change in a big way, we have now dug ourselves into a deep hole. And it's going to require both dramatic reductions in emissions of these heat-trapping gases and active efforts to remove them from the atmosphere. Okay, both are necessary if we're going to avoid even more catastrophic impacts of climate change. Well, what does the ocean have to do with this? The ocean has already saved us from more severe effects of climate change. It's a giant thermal inertia machine storing up a lot of that heat energy that these gases have been trapping, preventing the Earth's temperature from getting even hotter. It's also removing huge amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, 2 or 3 billion tons of carbon every year. In fact, the ocean stores far more carbon than all of the land masses and forests put together. So, because of these properties of the ocean, and because there's some understanding, thanks to the scientists at this institution and scientists around the world, of the mechanisms by which the ocean removes these gases, there's a lot of interest in using the ocean as a way to accelerate the drawdown of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to reduce the rate of global warming. So this will look familiar to a lot of you, but just to review, there's many mechanisms by which the ocean moves gases around. And one of them is a solubility pump. These are the physical mechanisms, the downwellings of salty, cold water in certain regions of the ocean, and also the biological processes that center on the food web, wherein the plankton take carbon dioxide in dissolved form out of the seawater. That drives what we call a disequilibrium, a difference in the concentration of carbon dioxide in the ocean relative to that in the atmosphere. And that results in a movement of the carbon from the area of higher pressure, the atmosphere, to the area of lower pressure, the ocean. Now, that carbon ordinarily, right, in some areas of the ocean just gets recycled in the food web because the large plankton are eaten by zooplankton. The zooplankton are eaten by little larval fishes. The little larval fishes are eaten by bigger fishes, and so on. And so the carbon that's absorbed by those phytoplankton ends up in the bodies and in the respiratory gases and in the fecal pellets of other organisms. So it goes around and around in a circle, and some of it pops back into the atmosphere. So there's no net carbon export from the surface water, unless you have bigger organisms that are falling to the bottom, like whales, or dead fish, or their fecal pellets. Those bigger particles are key to exporting carbon from the surface water into the deep waters, where that carbon can remain for hundreds or even thousands of years before it ventilates back to the atmosphere. So that's the key to how the ocean sequesters carbon biologically. Based on these fundamental principles of carbon removal by the ocean, people are exploring many mechanisms for accelerating those processes. So for example, folks are thinking about, well, maybe if we enhance the weathering of rocks that produce alkalinity in the ocean, that will cause the ocean to absorb more carbon chemically. There's also approaches that rely on that biological carbon pump that I just described, which involve fertilizing the ocean either by upwelling deep water that's rich in nutrients to stimulate artificial plankton blooms and hope that some of that gets exported down into the deep water. There are proposals to greatly expand the growing of aquatic biomass like seaweeds and hope that some of that carbon gets exported to the bottom of the sea. There's many, many approaches that are developing very rapidly. And because entrepreneurs are sensing an opportunity to make money, there are many, many businesses that are starting up around these mechanisms. The business model is essentially, if we can prove that our company, using some technique, can remove X amount of carbon from the atmosphere, then we can sell that on the carbon credit market and finance our operation and make a profit. Now, the problem with this is that a lot of the innovation is being driven by these companies and investors, and it's really outpacing the rate of scientific understanding of these processes. So this creates a risk, not only for those businesses, but a risk for dealing with climate change, because unless those carbon removals are well documented with science, it will result in poor accounting, right, of all the greenhouse gases emissions and reductions in the world. And that will let people off the hook to continue to emit greenhouse gases. And the ocean presents a special challenge for doing that science. It's much, much more dynamic than terrestrial systems are. It's moving constantly at many different scales, from the microscopic to the gigantic. And so when things move around like that, it's hard to do an experiment to show definitively that adding alkalinity or enhancing the weathering of rocks or growing seaweed or whatever your intervention is will actually do what you think it's going to do. And another set of questions is around what risks do those interventions pose and how do we study them in such a dynamic environment? Science is making some progress toward answering these questions. There's primarily models that are being developed, since it's hard to collect the data we need at scale in the ocean. So it's a reasonable start to try to model these things. This is just an example of a recent model that suggests that if we do an intervention like add alkalinity in the spot off North Africa, the effect, the PCO2 anomaly, which is this difference in carbon dioxide partial pressure between the ocean and the atmosphere, that will spread over almost the entire North Atlantic in about 15 years. So we need much more research on a number of dimensions before we start to implement these innovations designed to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and put it in the ocean safely, right? So one of them is just efficacy. Because the carbon can be remineralized by many mechanisms in the surface water, how confident are we that the carbon absorbed by those phytoplankton in the surface water actually gets exported to the deep ocean? Can we measure those rates? Can we measure those reservoirs? And how long will the carbon remain, right? Additionality is another aspect of high integrity greenhouse gas accounting. And this has to do with, we don't want to grant credit for reducing greenhouse gas emissions unless the proponent can show that that removal would not have occurred absent the intervention, right? That's how you get credit. Really hard to prove. And it creates some dilemmas, like what about indigenous people who have been stewarding mangrove forests for centuries, kept them in good condition? They cannot demonstrate additionality, and yet they're saving that carbon and saving the planet from additional warming that would result from releasing that carbon through deforestation. So there's lots of open questions, both social, economic, and scientific, around this question of additionality. Leakage is similar in that you don't want to grant a credit for a project that's going to just result in some other greenhouse gas emission elsewhere. So for example, you can replant a mangrove forest after you cut it down. You can get some credit for the carbon that's being removed by those mangrove forests from the atmosphere and embodied in wood, roots, rhizomes, and peat. So that's pretty solid, you know, in terms of efficacy of carbon removal and sequestration. But did you think about the methane and nitrous oxide emissions that are going to result from those restored systems? Unless you get the hydrology right, unless the sediments are right, those emissions of powerful greenhouse gases might in fact outweigh the effects of the carbon you removed. And so we wouldn't want to grant credit to that. And permanence, we already talked about. This is simply how long do those greenhouse gases stay sequestered, or do they pop back up into the atmosphere? So to have a really strong policy, and this is kind of where science kind of moves into the policy sphere, can we do the science necessary to account for these criteria and make sure that these innovations designed to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere are not doing more harm than good, actually doing what they say they're doing, and not posing risks to the ocean ecosystem and the people who depend on them? And there's a lot of risks. Again, the ocean is complex. There's a lot of mechanisms that can be disturbed by these innovations, particularly as they move from the bench scale to the mesocosm scale, medium scale, to the large scale field trials, to full implementation. Because after all, these are intended to remove billions of tons of carbon. So they have to be large scale to be effective. And so that means the risks associated with doing these things are also large scale. And, you know, I won't go through all these things, but you can imagine just by living here on the ocean and understanding it as you do, that adding a whole bunch of alkalinity, grinding up rocks, you know, and dumping them into the ocean to increase alkalinity could introduce toxic materials, could emit more greenhouse gases as you're grinding up the rocks and dumping them in the ocean. Similarly, you know, let's say that fertilizing the ocean with iron or upwelling nutrients actually does stimulate a phytoplankton. We know with pretty high confidence that that will happen in nutrient-limited waters, right? But what we don't know is what happens to that biomass. And if it's successful and several 100 million metric tons of carbon, organic carbon, make its way down to the bottom of the sea, which is already low in oxygen, what will happen? Will it become anoxic? Will we have huge dead zones on the bottom of the sea like we do already off of the Gulf of Mexico? We don't know. And as I mentioned, people depend on these processes. They're known as ecosystem services, the things that the ocean does that help people survive and thrive, prosper. So to the extent that we disrupt these fundamental processes that drive ocean productivity and biodiversity, we will also disrupt a lot of these services like fishing, recreation, the habitat that supports biodiversity, and so on. Now, in an ideal world, this whole process of developing approaches to remove carbon from the atmosphere using the ocean would proceed in this logical way. You know, so some guy has an idea, or some person has an idea, you do some lab work to kind of prove the idea out, you collect data, you use the data, create some models to see what would happen if you scaled it up. Once you're pretty sure that nothing terrible is going to happen when you scale up to the mesocosm, where you put something out in the actual ocean, you do that, you monitor it. Then if everything looks good, you go to a field trial. And then if everything looks good, then you're ready for full-scale implementation. but that's not what's happening now. As I said before, the entrepreneurs and the investors in these technologies are sort of running ahead of where the science is because they work at different paces. Look at the pace of technology development versus the pace of scientific understanding development, right? There's a mismatch between those two. And it means that we're already seeing field trials being implemented around the world where places don't have very good governance over ocean interventions like this. And there's very little oversight. There's no international law that says you cannot do this. And so it's happening right now at very large scales. So let me leave you with these questions, and I hope we can have a good discussion around these, because these are the things that I'm thinking about a lot, and I hope that we'll have a good public discourse in this country and around the world about, like, can these ocean carbon dioxide removal technologies really remove significant amounts of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere without emitting more, right? What are the risks to natural ecosystems and people? How can we understand those risks? How can we mitigate them? And this is called the moral hazard problem, which concerns me too. Will research and development in this space of how can we remove carbon from the atmosphere distract people from the other goal that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, which is the need for really dramatic reductions in emissions of greenhouse gases? So I promised I would leave you with questions. Let me stop there and thank you for your attention. And I think we're going to entertain questions both from our internet audience and from our audience here. So thanks a lot.
All right, so I'm going to turn the lights up so that we can see one another a little bit better. And we're going to jump back and forth between questions online and questions in the room. We've been given a lot of time to have a really good discussion, but you'll have to be a little bit patient with me if you're going to have me run to you. So feel free to use the mic up there if you would like. But I want to start. Roseanne, do you have any questions online yet? Okay, so folks online, if you have any questions at all or you want to engage in this conversation, please put those questions into the chat box. But I see a question in the room and we'll go there first.
Thank you, Rod, for that insightful presentation and for your questions. And I'm actually going to add another one, but rather than throw this out for discussion amongst the group here, I want to hear your thoughts on how do you professionally, and how do you think EDF, Environmental Defense Fund, should balance the risk of the unknown with the risk of no action?
Great question. You know, I often, when people ask me this question, I often return to the fact that when you're a scientist working at the interface of data and models and policymaking, you have to factor in values as well, right? Risk is not a scientific question. Your risk tolerance, science can characterize a risk, right? But science can't tell you, like, how fast to drive your car, or how to avoid those risks, how cautious you are, how courageous you are, That's a human values-driven thing. And that's why there's so many different opinions about, do the risks outweigh the benefits? At EDF, what we know is that if we can create a space and a framework for policymakers to carefully evaluate information on each of these dimensions, one at a time, right? And then synthesize that and make explicit their assumptions about risk tolerance, we'll get a better decision. That's a lot of how a lot of environmental disputes and conflicts are resolved, is to create space for rational analysis so that we don't use our fast mind that depends on heuristics and quick judgments. We depend on our slow mind, which is more deliberative and can assimilate things like efficacy, uncertainty, risk, to whom, to what, and also cost factors into this, right? So that's how EDF sees its role in this space, is to try to create spaces and tools for policymakers to digest the enormous amount of information that's being developed into a good decision using those dimensions.
All right. Okay, other question in the room?
That was great. Thank you. I was wondering if you have a favorite project somewhere in the world that you can share with us that you think is going well and that would be helpful.
Thanks for that. You know, I had a lot of conversations with people today here at Hatfield, and you know, there's quite a lot of despair and anxiety about the things that we just talked about. And I just want to acknowledge that it's really hard when if you're thoughtful people and you care about the world, it's challenging just emotionally. And I think it's important for us to talk about our successes and things that inspire us. And, you know, I wrote my first book, Heal the Ocean, for this very reason. You know, I was seeing all these headlines and I'd go talk about fisheries and people would be really depressed. And part of it is because the headlines are all about bad news, you know, and it's hard to find those inspiring stories unless you are in this career and you get the opportunity to travel the world like I have for years and years. So yeah, there's lots of them, but the one I'm really excited about now is happening in the Philippines. It's in a province, Southern Leyte province, that is really vulnerable to climate change. And the reason we chose to work in this place is precisely because it's one of these communities that is on the short end of the climate injustice stick, you know? So the industrialized countries have prospered, developed gigantic GDPs, partly from emitting greenhouse gas emissions, burning fossil fuels, creating the climate crisis. Whereas these other countries in the tropics, largely, have contributed relatively little to the problem, but are suffering the brunt of the effects. And so this community has been hit by several unusually strong typhoons in the last few years. Sea level is starting to erode the coastlines there. The mangrove forests are wrecked. The seagrass meadows are a mess. The fisheries have been depleted. I'm like, this is a good news story. The punchline is that the community has organized with a little help from EDF and has demanded better for themselves. So we managed to score, you know, a grant to support some work to restore that mangrove forest, to increase the resilience of that coastline to the inevitable increase in sea level rise and the associated storm surge. We are restoring the seagrass meadows there with the help of local fishermen who've become interested in collaborative research. They've done a wonderful job in improving the fisheries management there so that there's a promise of rebuilt fish populations in the next 5 years. And the project I'm running has to do with building a seaweed farm in this area. One, to generate alternative livelihoods to help these folks out who have very few other economic alternatives to fishing. So while they wait for the fish populations to rebuild, they need to do something. And so we're trying to develop a seaweed farming industry in this area as a source of alternative revenue and livelihoods. But we're also doing a lot of science on the seaweed farm because I think seaweed is one of those interventions that I described that can remove carbon at a profit for people, right? Because seaweed farming is already profitable. Yeah, we're producing 30 million metric tons a year. So it's supporting an industry already. And it's very low risk. You know, yes, it's possible to farm seaweed in a really unsustainable way. Like if you put your farm over a coral reef, that's bad. But we know enough not to do that. And so we're monitoring this farm very carefully to see if we can answer some of these questions. How much carbon is that seaweed removing? I don't know if any of you are familiar with seaweed, but that's what I was doing when I was doing my work here at Hatfield. And I was amazed at how fast these things grow. That's why they're called seaweeds, right? They just, you know. And while they're growing, they're absorbing huge amounts of carbon. The problem is that seaweeds are very leaky, and so they leak that photosynthate out. They grow really fast. They're like, hungry dogs. They just wolf their food in, and they're messy eaters, and a lot of the carbon goes back into the water, so it remineralizes. So our idea that we're testing in the Philippines is, what if we harvested that seaweed and turned it into cement, right? What if we harvested seaweed and extracted the phytochemicals in it that enhance crop yield 30 or 40%? Would that help farmers use less chemical fertilizer and thereby reduce the greenhouse gas emissions associated with fertilizer use and the N2O emissions associated with applying too much fertilizer, which is a global problem, right? Can we turn that seaweed into plastics to replace those single-use plastics? I know it's upsetting. But can we turn the seaweed into a carbon neutral or carbon positive replacement for all that saran wrap that we just use once to wrap seafood or whatever, then throw it away? And then it creates microplastic in the ocean. So we're looking for those win-win solutions where these things can generate money for the community, can employ people, and also do something with that carbon other than just release it back into the atmosphere. And add even more value to the community that way. So I'm really excited about that. It's catching on, people are interested in, and we'll see where it goes, but that gives me some inspiration.
All right, we've got a question online. Go ahead, Roseanne.
Regardless of the OCDR method, who will pay the entrepreneurs if they're successful? Is there any opportunity to manage the OCDR trials by managing the funding sources?
What a great question. And in fact, we are trying to do just that. So I don't know if all of you caught that, but the question was, okay, you've got all these entrepreneurs, they need money, right? Is that a leverage point, right, to get them to adhere to some codes of conduct? And that is precisely the intent of the strategy we're pursuing right now. First, we're taking a voluntary approach. We're trying to socialize. Well, first of all, we work with a bunch of other researchers and scientists, including the American Geophysical Union, to come up with a consensus set of codes of conduct to guide this research, to create safeguards so that we don't do more harm to the ocean than good at the experimental phase. Now, the big question is, how do you get people to adopt it? And as I often say, the natural sciences are only part of the equation, right? The bigger question is the human behavioral part. How do you get people to think and act differently is a major question for us at EDF, because we want to see the science being put to use for positive solutions. So our first step is to convene a lot of these entrepreneurs, have a dialogue with them, try to explain to them why this is necessary. Also, we're talking to their investors to see if we can get them to condition their financing on adherence to these codes of conduct to create another hammer or incentive. And then finally, we're working on some legislation that would authorize a new program in the US government to oversee this ocean carbon dioxide removal research, create a governance structure, create accountability mechanisms, reporting, metrics, and regulation around that to, again, prevent adverse effects on marine ecosystems and people while we're pursuing these lines of research at larger and larger scales.
All right, we've got questions in the room.
Yeah, and thank you for this talk. You mentioned that the technology is outpacing our scientific understanding, and there's sort of this gap in between those two entities. And I'm wondering, there's another gap between the political system and the sciences. So what can we do to close that gap at this current environment?
Okay, yeah, put me on the spot. Well, We are studiously nonpartisan at EDF, but I can say in general that, yeah, a lot of our politics are broken. There's, I think, in my view, sort of a falling away of collective action, you know, and that's one of the things I really find inspiring about this place, actually. I took a tour of the facility, and the whole place is built around fostering collaboration. So there's a relationship between a physical space, like if your lab is siloed versus you're working in the same space as a whole bunch of other science, you're going to have more interaction. When you have a cafe in your lab, as opposed to just a bunch of offices and labs, you're going to have more collaboration. So physical space can foster the kinds of values, right, that we have and hold. And there's many other ways. We call it choice architecture in my book, Making Shift Happen. There are ways to design policies and buildings and social interactions to foster more of that collective spirit, the feeling that we can get together and do big things. And that's really the basis for good politics, right? That's what politics is supposed to be about, is bringing people together around big projects like building the highway system or establishing the national parks. This country has been doing great things for many years, and I hope we can do it again. That's all I can say on that. Thanks for the question.
All right, question online.
What are the projects on the West Coast, and what's the regulatory framework that allow these to proceed?
Yeah, there's a couple of land-based projects in California that I'm familiar with, which are really at the highly engineered end of the spectrum and may not impact the ocean at all because they're contained. So these are the direct air capture sort of technologies that use sorbents to just capture. They use giant fans to suck a lot of air in, remove the carbon chemically, and then they're faced with the question of like, what do we do with the effluent, right? That's now full of carbon. Now, let's hope that they don't dump it in the ocean. And they can also think of clever things to do with that carbon. I mean, the carbon, you can view it as a pollutant, right? You can also view it as a resource. So yeah, the world needs more carbon for lots of things like cement and plastics and alternatives to fossil fuels. So that's one set of projects. I'm working with a couple of seaweed farmers in the state of Washington who are really interested in measuring the carbon sequestration by their farms, and also the ecosystem services that those farms are providing for people, like biodiversity enhancement. Seaweeds also have this remarkable property, like phytoplankton do actually too. While they're growing and taking that carbon dioxide out of the seawater, they're actually increasing the pH a little bit. And when you grow lots and lots of seaweed in very dense masses on the farm, you can actually measure a change in the pH. So it's one of the only ways that you can change the ocean acidity problem, right? The other half of global warming that we don't talk about much. As a result of absorbing all that carbon dioxide over the last 150 years during the Industrial Revolution, the ocean has slowly become more acid. This is really bad for a lot of marine organisms, and even for oyster farmers and shellfish farmers and harvesters. So we really got to do something about it. Reducing carbon dioxide emissions, of course, is key. But in the meantime, what does an oyster farmer do, right? When the ocean is acidifying around his crop and killing the larvae, it may be possible to grow seaweed to alleviate that problem by bumping up that pH by a tenth of a point.
All right, I'm just going to put the other side of the room on standby. I'm going to take one more question from this side, and then I'm coming to you, so get ready.
So it was a great talk, and it's very stimulating. One of the sort of things that bothers me is that carbon sequestration, the only things that seem to make any sense at all involve photosynthesis, fixing it, pumping, grabbing CO2 out of the atmosphere and pumping it underground seems like that's impossible to be energetically that it could work, because you got the energy by burning it. And now you're claiming you're going to make coal again and somehow come out ahead. That seems totally impossible. So And then, but the other part of it is, well, two parts. One is that we have to be underestimating what the effects are because we can't measure them.
Yeah.
Very likely, we're vastly underestimating what the effects of all this changes. We can't be hyperbolic about it because it's more than we know. But the other part of it is when on these big projects where they're going to sequester carbon, most of them don't really explain where all the calories are. How many calories are there?
Yeah.
And how many are going to be, it seems to me there's this mitigation that you can do. And then the other thing is that we're talking about here. And the other part of it is what's the value of just not burning energy? I mean, the cost of burning energy, the expense of burning energy relative to all other sources of energy. It seems to me that that's the horrible balance, and it's the political system and everything else. How do you make it so that there's some way of showing or demonstrating what the cost of that burned energy is relative to other kinds of sources for everything, for all of it?
Yeah. Well, the simple answer is good accounting. This is just another example of the poor state of science that we're in, that nobody's answering these questions. Yeah, when you talk to direct air capture guys, they'll say something, oh, we're going to plug into a clean grid, so don't worry about it, right? Along with the millions of other electric cars, and the grid's already kind of overburdened. So no, you're right to ask that question, and that's why personally I favor these photosynthetic methods, because we're not burning fossil fuels. We're utilizing these natural processes. They're called natural carbon solutions, or nature-based carbon solutions, as opposed to these highly engineered solutions that typically do require quite a lot of energy to remove that carbon. So I agree with you. The energy balance doesn't really make sense to me for those approaches, but harnessing photosynthesis might do the trick. What you really need, and what we're doing in the Philippines on our project, is a life cycle analysis that carefully accounts for every step of the production process, right? From where the power came from and the emissions associated with that, to how many materials and what kind did you use to build your farm, how much gas are you using to maintain the farm, and all the way to the end use of the product. So again, the answer is just better accounting, and to try to force people to do that will require, I think, a mandatory carbon market, right? That's much, much more rigorous than the voluntary market that's currently driving this financing right now.
All right, Roseanne, you have a question online.
Who's currently regulating these in-ocean experiments you show on your world map? Is it the individual countries?
Yeah, the problem is nobody is regulating them, frankly. I should step back and say that some countries like Iceland have some rules in place that can cover aspects. And in some cases, the London Protocol, anti-dumping protocol, is used to regulate, the dumping of iron filings or alkalinity into the ocean. But none of these policies in any country is really adequate, nor are they designed to deal with ocean carbon dioxide removal, because it's too new. And we talked about the mismatch between the pace of scientific development and entrepreneurialism. There's an even bigger mismatch between entrepreneurial development and governance, right? The wheels of government turn slowly. So we're trying to turn that up and get this bill passed in the next Congress to create, the US will, if the bill passes, the US will then be the first country to have an OCDR governance system.
All right, I'm on the other side of the room. Is there a question over here? Awkward pause.
There's one down here, Cinnamon.
All right, we've got some on the other side. Okay, everybody.
Getting your steps in.
Yep. Okay, I didn't see the hands on this side, but I saw people pointing at people. All right.
Thank you. I have a quick question, which is a trick one, probably. How do you see artificial intelligence helping you on this quest in this project?
It's got its pros and cons and benefits and dangers, of course. but we're actually at EDF trying to use a form of artificial intelligence called machine learning to help us answer a very fundamental question. So, as you can tell, I'm kind of gung-ho about seaweed. I can't even tell you now how much carbon the world's seaweed farms are removing from the atmosphere to help make my case, because we do not know how many seaweed farms there are in the world and how big they are. So we don't even have that basic number that we need to multiply by the sequestration rate to get the total sequestration. So the way we're approaching this is we developed what's called a labeled data set of known seaweed farms throughout the Philippines, about 100 of them. We know their GPS locations. We know exactly how big they are, what kind of seaweed they're growing. And then we've trained the computer with this machine learning algorithm to recognize different kinds of farms, different configurations. So it's like training a dog or a baby. It's like, this is farm, this is land, this is, this is water. And if you do that enough times with enough data, the machine eventually gets it and can then automatically classify images that it picks up from a satellite, image of an entire country and eventually the whole world, we hope, and tell you, okay, yeah, that's a farm, that's a farm, that's a farm. And then we can add up those numbers to get this calculation done. Just one example. There are many, many applications of AI in science. Many of you here in the audience are probably way ahead of me in those techniques. But yeah, it's a powerful tool. I think, like anything, we need to have the wisdom to use it. We have this tendency in human history to develop these powerful tools and not know how to use them well. And so bad things happen.
So I'm going to steal the mic for a second and ask
Yeah.
you a question. You've got a lot of students in the audience. Where do you see an effective way for them to engage in this issue and this problem from where you're watching and looking?
Yeah, well, first to the students, I need to apologize for failing to deal with climate change in 1990 when we had a chance. And actually, seriously, that's one of the reasons why I'm focused on fighting climate change at this kind of end stage of my career. It's like, yeah, we blew it. And now I think that, I guess the bright side of that, if it is a bright side, it has created a huge opportunity for young, creative people with lots of energy to help address some of these major questions that we will need to answer in order to have a safe pipeline, let's say, of techniques to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to help us meet this challenge and avoid these much more severe impacts. So there's a role for basic science, of course. We need to keep expanding the frontiers of our knowledge. Some of these questions really hinge on just getting a basic understanding of how, say, the mesopelagic ecosystem works, right? We don't even know how many fishes are out there. What is the biomass? How much carbon is in there? And that's going to require the really imaginative use of an array of technologies like acoustic sounders, eDNA to match up the species with those echolocation signals. So basic science, technology development to make sensors that are cheap and we can deploy all around the world to get the data we need, improve the ocean observing network. There's so many opportunities. And I'm hoping I can talk to some of you students tomorrow during our seminar. We can dive a little deeper into that.
So the other audience members that are out here often, as I'm looking around, are community members. So if we have engaged and active community members, where should they put their energy?
Yeah, well, first of all, yeah, thanks for coming to this talk about something that maybe you haven't thought about every day. But the key to it really is to stay informed as a citizen. Try to live your values. I think it was Gandhi that once said, like, we need to be the change we want to see in the world. And so we all got to do what we can in our own lives. It does add up to an aggregate effect on the issues we care about. And, we exercise our power as citizens through democracy. And so we need to fight for the democratic process and to continue to elect leaders that do represent our interests and values.
I'm not sure I can follow up on that, but Francis is going to try.
Yes, I won't. But Rod, thank you for bringing this conversation to our community. really powerful. You laid out the problem of the venture capital is moving fast and science is moving slow. Is there a strategy for science to be fast? Do you see a way that we can catch up within our academic community so that we are not the laggards, that we don't keep us from getting to the right solution?
You know, Francis, your research comes to mind actually as a way to accelerate that, right? So one of the problems with experimental science and ship-based science is that you need a big ship that costs thousands of dollars an hour to operate. So there's only so much data you can gather, even if you have a fleet of big ships or you have a fancy lab like this. And you know what Francis and other people have been doing here at Hatfield and around the world is to develop what's called collaborative research with fishermen, right? There are 3 million fishing vessels roaming the ocean. There's a great research platform that we can use to expand the reach of research and, as a byproduct, get the buy-in, right, from fishermen who might not otherwise care about it. Francis told me yesterday about, you know, he's got this research program where fishermen are taking sensors out on their gear and providing valuable data on the hypoxic zone here. And one day he saw a guy out, you know, and he asked him, "Where are you going? You know, it's this terrible fishing condition." "Yeah, I'm fishing for data," you know? And that's the kind of mindset change we need so that all of us are contributing to the scientific enterprise and expanding our capacity by taking advantage of all these interested citizens who have these, you know, powerful computers in their back pocket, right, with lots of sensors, lots of valuable data there.
All right, we've got a couple more questions here.
Thanks for that presentation. So you've highlighted a lot of the strategies and technologies to utilize the ocean to overcome carbon footprint. But you alluded to the larger problem, which is the focus on reduction of our practices, particularly our population's behavior. I'm curious to know if you could highlight some of EDF's strategies, projects that are looking at changing population behavior to reduce carbon footprints.
Yeah, great question. Well, like I said before, understanding human behavior is crucial, right? So at EDF, we have a bunch of natural scientists, but we have added a bunch of social scientists in recognizing this need and just reflect the understanding that people are really at the root of the problem. The things we do every day, you know, the car we drive, the light bulbs we use, the amount of, you know, water we use in the shower, that's what adds up to this aggregate gigantic effect on the entire planet, right? So behavior change is the key to solving these environmental problems, not necessarily the natural science. And natural science is a necessary component, but not sufficient. And that's what policy is for, and that's what economic incentives are for, and that's what we call choice architecture is for. So those are the 3 levers that we use at EDF to try to get people to do things that are better for the environment. So the first one, policy, is kind of obvious. You know, I'm writing a bill to try to authorize this program and try to get these companies to comply with the code of conduct and do a better job. EDF also has written a bill in California to regulate carbon emissions. It's called AB 32. It's a cap and trade program. And the reason it's cap and trade is that, you know, our view was that if we're going to get these big industrial sectors to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, they have to see some profit in it, you know? And so the cap and trade mechanism and the ability to offset those emissions is a way to incentivize those utilities and, you know, other industries to comply with that overall cap. So the aggregate cap is met through individual actions of these actors. There's really gnarly problems that policy can't get at, though, which, like diets, you know, food and the way we produce our food is a major contributor to the climate crisis. We have a big program at EDF trying to make agriculture smarter. We're trying to get cows to burp less. We're trying to reduce emissions from the manure because it's big, but really consumers can do a lot to change those emissions as well through better choices. And that's a hard one for policy. Nobody wants a government telling you, you must eat this sustainable seafood, right? There's no way that Americans would go for that. But, dietitians, other professionals, doctors, people who we trust and rely on for good advice to do things that are both good for our health and good for the planet, that's where we can get some behavior change, right? Not through the government. So we need to be smart about which of those levers to use. Where can we create economic incentives? Where can we kind of write laws to compel compliance? And where do we need to use more subtle methods to help people make better choices for themselves and for the environment?
All right, we're going to take one more question and then we're going to wrap up.
Thank you so much for your talk, and thank you for hosting it here. This is a world-class research institution we're all graced with here in this community. My question is, how do I funnel community needs along a coast subject to all these climate change stressors to a legislature that isn't always listening? How can small city government channel and incentivize systemic change based from some maybe wins you've had in your career?
I think it's all about organizing. So one initiative that was pretty cool that we did over the last couple of years involved mayors of towns all along the coast. In this case, it was Connecticut. We tried to do it in California as well. But the idea was to, we had noticed that there was quite a lot of demand from people along, the coast of the United States to grow more seaweed, because it's having a moment, it's in the news, it's profitable, and there's all these cool new products that you can make from seaweed. So if you're a mission-driven company, you're interested in seaweed lettuce. And the problem is that the permitting structures are so difficult to navigate and so expensive that only huge corporations could really navigate that. So we organized a bunch of municipalities. Mayors played a key role, as well as their constituents, to create a groundswell of support, starting from the citizens who wanted to do the seaweed farming, to people who supported them, to the ports where they wanted to operate in, to the mayors of the municipalities that they operate in, and create like a groundswell that we could then communicate to senators and congresspeople and ask them, can you do an appropriation to help these people out and create an aquaculture innovation center that would create an umbrella permit that would help these smaller entrepreneurs who don't have the resources to access that to operate under until they can prove their business models. And Chris Murphy in Connecticut said yes, and now we have an aquaculture innovation center in Connecticut. So it's possible. It's really people power. I know that sounds hackneyed, but it's just basic political organizing and multiplying your power by joining with other people, other mayors, to create a louder voice that's going to influence the politicians.
All right, I'm going to hand it back to you, Rod. Do you have any last words for us as we wrap up tonight?
No, is there more sipping to be done?
Yes, if you're willing to stick around a little bit longer, I was just going to say for folks in the room that didn't get their questions answered or wanted to do it in a more one-on-one format, we'll have a little bit of time where you can ask those questions. We're also going to continue the conversation around seaweed tomorrow.
Yeah.
So there is a seminar that will occur in this room at 11 a.m., which is different than our normal seminar time, that anybody who wants to continue that conversation could come and join us and be a part of that seminar. So we'll keep the conversation going.
Thanks. And I just want to say thank you again for coming, and thanks for your interest in this topic.
One more round of applause for our speaker.
Yeah.
All right, everybody. We'll see you next fall or maybe tomorrow, depending on your interest. Thanks, everyone.